Absolutely, yeah. So I had the unique experience of growing up in a cult, and it was like a real life, like Book of Revelations, end of days, the apocalypse will be here in 6 months, um, you know, end of the world cult, and highly isolated. You couldn't have any kind of social interactions outside the membership of the cult. It was a pretty interesting childhood. Uh,
I can imagine. Well,
and
I don't know if I can actually.
uh, and it was one of those things where, at an early age, I uh, understood that there was a lot of bullshit here, and this was not where I wanted to be. And uh, and the other thing too was growing up in a family that didn't have a history of education.
Hello, and welcome back to the Blooming Late Scientist podcast. We've had some great guests on so far, but I'm super excited today because we've got an absolute legend on here. Now, if you're on LinkedIn and you're in marketing, you might already know Dale Harrison. Very active on LinkedIn, is totally, talking complete sense for once on LinkedIn when it comes to marketing. And we're here to talk about Dale's background and, all of his kind of journey and what he's been through to get where he is. So at the moment, Dale, just to let everyone know, you're a commercial strategist in the biotech industry, right?
Right, and probably more in with clinical diagnostics companies.
Yeah.
But I work with clients in biotech as well, in the research tools, and but a lot of the more interesting problems and the higher value companies and the higher value work tends to be in diagnostics, simply because it's closer to the patient.
So we're gonna go back, but let's start with, because I think a lot of people actually just use the term commercial strategy and they have no idea what that means. So what is it that you do? What does that mean?
Um, so you have this nice thing you built. How are you going to get it in the hands of anybody who's going to use it, and how are you going to be able to separate people from their money, um, and convince them to buy this thing? And so this covers a wide range of things. It's uh, how do you get the product launched? What's the how do you market it? How do you talk about it? How do you position it in the market? All of the sales operations. So, what does it take to build a sales organization that is going to successfully go after the right market, as well as things like distribution and partnerships. So, especially if you're a tools company, can you get into Millipore or get into Thermo with it? And then if you do, how do you, that's not some magic bullet. They're not going to magically make your product fly off the shelf because you're one of 80,000 SKUs. uh, so what do you have to do with your internal marketing and your internal sales to work in conjunction with Thermo and the Thermo reps in order to get them to sell your stuff? And so there's a lot of complexity in that issue of how do you go from a great thing that works to actually turning it into a commercially viable product that where you've got sustainable growth, sustainable predictable revenue. And and it's a challenge because a lot of these companies, they're scientist led, they're overly focused on product, and as a result, there is this sort of almost universal tendency to think that this thing is so amazing that as soon as word leaks out, people will be shoving POs under our door at night, and and they and they'll do things like keep the product a secret until launch. My recommendation
Oh
is,
yeah.
if you have not started aggressive active marketing 6 to 12 months before the product is ready, you're going to launch to crickets. That no one is going to know, because it's going to take you, typically 9 to 18 months before anybody even knows you exist. And uh, so it's things like this that the stuff you've got to do, starting with the recognition that selling stuff is hard and convincing people to do things in a different way with a new technology is very hard. And especially if you're selling into the clinical environment, it's a very conservative world. No one wants to take on something new if what they've got seems to be working okay, even if it's even if they have problems with it, it's still the thing they know. And uh, so these become huge challenges, and it's not just enough to have a great product. And I can't tell you the number of companies I've seen with just truly astounding, revolutionary products that that worked flawlessly, and they could not get out of their way in terms of getting it into the market and selling it.
Yeah. It must be so frustrating. I mean, it's so hard to change mindsets anyway, isn't it? But so these companies, kind of the companies that you work with, what stages are they at?
So a lot of these are fairly early stage. So they're typically VC backed. Oftentimes I'll get involved pre-launch and help them with the product launch,
Hmm.
up through kind of revenue acceleration. So, where you're getting predictable traction in the market.
Yeah.
A lot of times, even with, a good commercialization effort and a great product, you get this effect that I call trying to push a rope across the table, where you're doing all these things and there's just no response, that
Mm.
the market isn't really responding, and you have to keep shifting and testing what you're doing to try to find the right target and the right approach, to be able to get to develop interest and awareness, and to be able to start to get people to want to talk to you about it and to want to consider it. um, these things tend not to come automatically. The other
Mm.
thing is working with companies that are a bit more mature, but they've stalled. And there's sort of two versions of stalled. The sort of pushing a rope across the table problem, where they just never got traction. You're 2 years in, you've got a trickle of revenue, you're still burning on investor money, and you're just not getting the product to, you're not getting that kind of predictable growth in revenue. So how do you come in and and fix, diagnose it and then fix what's going wrong?
I mean, those kinds of problems, I think, not that I'm saying people can't learn them quickly, but it sounds like those are the sorts of problems that come with lots of experience of dealing with these kinds of problems. And of course, you've got a very, very diverse background in terms of your career and what you've achieved. So I really want to go back because I find it so fascinating, like your whole story. And I think others will just be absolutely mind blown. Um, but you started out, we will go back further, but you started out your career in physics, right?
Right. Yes.
So tell us a bit about that.
Did superconductivity work?
That's
so,
it.
and I ended up starting fairly young and then burning out fairly young.
Mm.
Um, so, it originally, there was probably more of an interest in mathematics. So at 14, I was at University of Oklahoma in this National Science Foundation Advanced Mathematics program, um, where I learned my first three computer programming languages then on an IBM 360 mainframe. And I started playing video games for the first time on the IBM 360 mainframe at the university. um, but uh, did so by 19, I was doing my initial the research that led to my initial papers. And by 23, I had a pretty strong publication record, quite a number of papers as first author, some in PhysRev Letters, which is the top journal in physics. As a matter of fact, two PhysRev Letters by the time I was 22. One is first author. So a good publication record. But I was also, I think, too young and too inexperienced, and didn't have enough of a support network, and really burned out. And basically, I was actually at MIT at the time, as a visiting scientist on a project, and resigned my position, packed everything up, drove to New Orleans, got a job as a crane operator in a refinery.
A bit of a
and
difference.
and I was gonna, and it was like, I've had it, and a lot of it was the academic politics, but it was like, I've completely had it. I'm just going to be a construction worker for the rest of my life. And and so I had left home early, and had to fully support myself. So I left home at 17 and had to fully support myself And so I did it by working in the refineries. So I would work between semesters and in the summer, and could make enough money to support myself and pay for all my schooling. And so I started out as a steel worker, basically hanging I-beams, and then became a rigger. And then at 19, I was a journeyman crane operator, making more money than my father, who was a welder.
I mean, it's just crazy.
So, uh, yeah. So when I burned out, I decided I'm just going to be a crane operator, and that lasted 6 months. And and then a year later, I started my first company. So,
What was it that made you? So obviously you burnt out, which is not surprising given your age and everything like that. But what was it like? You said you lasted 6 months. So what was the flip for you to say, no, actually, this is not what I want to do. I want to do something else.
um, I mean, being surrounded by people with eighth grade educations who's,
Yeah.
we're making insane amounts of money, because we were running, we were working what were called turnarounds, which were where you would do 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, at like union level rates.
Mm.
So you had people making an enormous amount of money, and all they could think to do with it was basically, drink it away, gamble it away, and what was left they'd spend on prostitutes. And it was there was a very particular culture there that was, just was lacked a certain amount of kind of intellectual stimulation.
Mm.
It's only so much beer you can drink, only so much gambling you can do.
Some people might argue that's not true, but so your first company, what did that look like? What was that doing?
So, and again, it was one of these things, and a lot of my career shifts have been things that fell out of the sky. So I was, I had had such a weird, hyper accelerated move through school,
Mm.
that there were lots of things that was interested in that I never had a chance to study. And so one of these was economics. And so I managed to talk my way into the graduate economics program because I really wanted to, uh, have a study with a focus on econometrics, which I thought at the time was very interesting math, and has a lot of tie-ins back to physics. So, so I'm working. So I'm still having to support myself during this time, and so I'm working as what's called a steeplejack, which is, this is like a high rigger that works in areas where cranes can't be used. And
Okay.
specifically, I worked with a crew that specialized in dismantling radio transmission towers. You basically climb to the top of the tower with a bunch of gear that you drag up on cables, and you unbolt the tower section, you know, 1,500 feet in the sky, section by section, and you lower the sections down to the ground. And uh, and so one of the companies we were working with was a radio telecommunications company that had this huge antenna farm, and business was growing, and they were out of space for more antennas. And so when they tried to put a new antenna in, the new antenna interfered with the existing antennas. And so what they needed was a highly customized antenna design, that would take into account the surrounding antennas and could shape the beam of the antenna so that it would not, be interfered by or interfere with the adjacent antennas in this sort of high density antenna farm. So it was a physics project, an engineering project, and a programming project. And this became kind of a theme for a long time because I had to develop a mathematical model. I had to, come up with a numerical, simulation. I then needed to write the code to run the simulation, to do the numerical calculations, and then I needed to translate that into a physical engineering design. And that became the kickstart for my first company. And what I ended up doing were these projects for ever larger companies, eventually really focusing on Fortune 100 companies that had some aspect of engineering, some aspect of physics, and some aspect of, software development in mathematics. And so one example of a project was, doing an engineering modeling package using artificial intelligence, systems around what we call expert systems. Is a type of development environment where you model things in terms of if then else
Yeah.
questions. And we were trying to simulate basically how chemical and mechanical engineers thought about um, production processes inside chemical plants, and what we were modeling was basically um, the processes inside different types of pieces of equipment that would produce air pollution, and then to be able to estimate the amount of air emissions that each piece of equipment in a plant was producing, and then to run the chemistry, model the chemistry as well, so that we could then speciate that emission. So we had X number of tons of emissions, and then it would be speciated across these different compounds based on the underlying chemistry that was occurring within the unit. So those are the sorts of project, and that was for Exxon. And that ended up actually being in use for probably 15, almost 20 years, translated into 8 languages, put into use all over the world. So those are the sorts of things that I tended to work on, but also a lot of automation, a lot of robotics, a lot of factory automation, and a lot of the logic behind automation in large
Mm.
scale industrial processes. So again, it was starting with the physics, and then picking up extra skills. So picking up the software development skills, picking up the engineering skills, and then applying that to problems in basically areas I never had worked in before. So the key thing was kind of leveraging forward from where you are by adding an extra skill or an extra 2 skills, because what happens is that I think the structure of academia and the structure of commerce is such that there's a tendency to push everyone to the center of a particular domain of knowledge.
Mm.
If you're a
Yeah.
biologist, there are certain things that biologists do. If you're an accountant, there are certain things an accountant does. And so both the job market and the academic environment have a tendency to try to make everyone sort of deep experts at the center of a domain of knowledge. But
Yeah.
but it turns out that all of the interesting problems exist out on the boundaries between 2 or more domains of knowledge. It's really hard to be, a top 0.1% biologist, or a top 0.1% engineer or physicist. But if you're a okay physicist who's also an okay programmer, who's also an okay robotics designer, you can start to work on specialized problems to where that combination of skills, none of which have to be extraordinary, it's just the fact that you've got this unusual combination of skills that then opens you up to work on very interesting problems that other people can't. So now you're highly valuable, um, simply because there aren't very many of you. Where you can be 10 times as great an expert in the center of your domain of knowledge, and not be nearly as valuable simply because there's so many of you. And as anybody with a biology degree would know.
I think a lot of people will find that appealing to hear because, as you know, like you just said, in academia, we're so forced into this like tunnel vision of what it is we can do. We have to stick within these kind of limits of what we can achieve. When actually, like you say, even if you're just okay at something and you're okay at something else and you're okay at something else and you combine those, that becomes quite powerful. But I guess the question I wanted to ask you is, how do you overcome the fear of going into something you don't know anything about?
I mean, you have to go in with the assumption that whatever it is, it's just a matter of learning something.
Mm.
And you've learned a lot of stuff before. This is just another thing to learn. It's uh, and anyone who's come out of academia, anyone who's come out of research, you've learned really hard things about something very narrow.
Yes.
Um, Not anything else you learn is not going to be, generally, will not be as hard as what you've already done. It's just going to be in a different area, and
Yeah.
and so a lot of it is just having the confidence that if you did it once, you can do it 10 more times in 10 different areas. And, uh, and the other thing that's fascinating on this for me is that, um, so to a slightly different anecdote. So I was at a point where I was running a biotech company that was the U.S. subsidiary of a French-owned German biotech, very complicated, and uh, so um, and one of the things we were doing, we were going to conferences, and because we were selling to researchers, it was a research tools product, and so when I had jumped into biotech, so I didn't jump into biotech till mid-career. When I jumped into biotech, the last formal training that I had in life sciences was my seventh grade biology class where I dissected a frog. Uh, I literally, because I was so focused on the math and physics when I was in university, um, that that I just had no room for anything like that, and uh, and so I literally had never had a biology class since the seventh grade, and but when I jumped into biotech, I went through a really focused period of probably 2 to 4 years of intentionally retraining myself in molecular biology and in virology, because these are the areas that the
Mm.
company involved in. And so and we had you know PhDs that had come out of academia in the company. I tapped them for advice in terms of tell me the curriculum I should work through. And I literally I started at the undergraduate level and I worked all the way into the graduate level. And I had plenty of people around me that I could ask questions. And the key thing there, and this has been true for a lot of the transitions I've made, is that uh, people's greatest barrier is the fear of feeling stupid. And especially if you're smart, because if you're smart and you've already been accomplished in one thing, it becomes emotionally difficult to put yourself in a situation where you feel stupid again.
Mm.
But the problem is that you know every highly experienced person started out as a highly inexperienced person that didn't know anything. Every smart person started out as a stupid person that hasn't learned it yet, and the barrier is the emotional challenge of having those feelings and understanding that this is not a representation of who you are. It's simply a representation of where you are temporarily. And, so it's this emotional barrier. And what you end up seeing are people that so heavily recoil from facing those emotional issues and those self identity issues that they hold themselves in a very narrow niche. That once they've achieved sort of recognition as an expert in X, whatever that is, they never want to stray from that because they never want to not feel like the expert because their sense of identity is so tied up with the sense of being an expert. And so, what you see are people that will tell you, oh, I have 20 years of experience in such and such. And I look at them and I think, no, you have 1 year of experience repeated 20 times.
It's so true.
And 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 this is how you go through life without ever growing. And
Mm.
so it's not a matter of learning or even just, it's not a matter of planning what you're going to do next, because my whole life has been a series of things that fell out of the sky, that looked interesting. And I'm thinking to myself, I think I can do that. And so I went through a phase where where I worked in finance. And so I started by doing, again, it's this sort of leveraging from where you're already an expert
Mm.
with one narrow area of expertise that if you can add a couple of extras, you now are valuable. And so I started my involvement on the financial side of things, doing valuation analysis for M&As. So looking at a company and coming up with different ways to establish a value for the company that would make
Mm.
sense. And so very mathematical, a lot of modeling. There's some programming involved because you're doing numerical calculations. And, so again, I'm leveraging skills that were already highly developed and then adding to it a few extra skills around, you know, portfolio analysis, how valuations are done, how finance is done, um, coupled with the language around it. And, by the end, I'm doing, uh, restructuring and recapitalization plans for turnarounds. And then I'm running turnarounds. I'm coming into companies and I'm basically doing this for real, as the guy in charge. But going back to the thing about, uh, working for this company, this U.S. subsidiary of a German biotech. So we go to conferences, and one of the things that I learned was that if you know maybe 200 vocabulary words and 10 or 12 core concepts, you're indistinguishable from a PhD. and and so
Why
uh,
does that not surprise me?
because one of the things was interesting was I would go to the scientific sessions of this conference, because there were areas of research that I was following in the literature I was interested in, and uh, and I could stand up and I could ask some questions, and then afterwards I go up and meet the speaker, and the speaker would just assume that I was a professor at some
Mm.
university. And I never revealed the fact that the last formal training I had in the life sciences was my seventh grade biology class where I dissected a frog. and and so a large part of making that jump of going from outside the tribe to inside the tribe, whether it's molecular biology, it's finance, it's software development, it's engineering, is what are the core concepts? There's usually only 10, 12, 15 core concepts, that are, no one of which is very hard. There's a couple of hundred vocabulary words. If you can master that quickly, and nobody should be able to everybody should be able to master that in 3 to 6 months.
Yeah.
Um, and if you can master that, you can now start to not only ask intelligent questions, but ask questions that sound so intelligent that they assume you know a lot more than you do. and uh, but that really opens the door for you to be taken seriously, to then work on projects. And so again, the other thing about sort of always living at the boundary of two or three unique skill areas is, and sort of taking, that one skill or that two skills you already have deep expertise in, and then leveraging in a new skill, is that nobody's asking for credentials.
Mm.
Nobody wants you to hold up your framed diploma, because they need someone to solve this problem, and there are so few of those people. They'll take what comes. And so a lot of your credentials and your past and your academic publication record and your all of that, nobody gives a damn about. The question is, we have a really hard problem that we're trying to figure out how to solve, and we think we've found somebody who might can help us, and that's all they need. And so, again, that as you move away from that, um, move away from that original area of expertise, where the credentials are everything,
Mm.
um, into new areas, those credentials become less and less important. And uh, and what becomes more and more important is your ability to address or solve or work on highly unusual problems. And the deal is, these are always the fun problems. The boring stuff is the stuff at the center of the discipline that everybody's clawing each other's eyes out to try to get at. It's far more interesting to work out in the middle of nowhere on
Yeah.
stuff that's really quite interesting and quite difficult. And uh but and then as you work on some of these things, and again, when I started doing M&A, valuation analysis for M&As, it was like I was the only one who knew enough math, so I just sort of got tossed in. and um and then I picked up everything else along the way. And at some point, I'm able to talk to like really serious finance people, and and I could sort of see in their eyes that they recognize me as a member of the tribe.
Yeah.
Because I'm saying the right, I have the right incantations and the right words. And I seem to sort of, I'm able to ask questions about certain areas of expertise that where the questions actually make sense. And and they're not looking at you like you're stupid anymore. But they're going to start, that's the starting point. They're going to look at you like you're stupid when you ask the dumb questions, but you have to start there. And, uh, and then that area will get interesting for a while, and you end up finding more work in that area. And then something new falls out of the sky that seems a bit more interesting. And, and so I think a lot of my career has been kind of leveraging from one area to the next, you know, to stay one step ahead of boredom,
Mm.
uh, to, keep finding things that are, interesting problems to me to be working on, and interesting areas to work in. And at some point, I mean, every area that I've worked in, at some point, it was like, I've I've learned enough. It's really boring. You know, I, you know, so I mentioned when I was 14, I picked up my first three programming languages. I ended up developing pretty high expertise in about 40 languages, programming languages, including 7 different assembly languages. But I reached a point to where it was like the thought of learning another programming language, is, is about as exciting as eating stale leftovers. It was like, I just can't get any enthusiasm up for it. There's nothing new here. It's all the same. It all looks the same. You've got 2 or 3 major paradigms in how languages are designed, and it's like, the only difference is the details.
Mm.
And it was, it was like, I just not interested in doing this anymore. And, but fortunately there were other things that were arising that I was interested in doing. So, and so that happens with a lot of these things, is that you just reach a point to where it's boring, and, there are shiny new things that are, that are randomly falling from the sky around you that you can pay attention to and go after. And, and the trick though is it's still not about knowledge, and it's not about being smart, and it's not about learning, because we've all have proven, that we can do those things. It's entirely the internal emotional states and the sense of not tying your sense of self identity and your sense of emotional stability too closely to, your sense of being an expert and your sense of expert knowledge within a given area, because that builds a wall around yourself that prevents you from ever leaving that area. And,
Yeah.
uh, so it's really very much an internal game, not an external game that you're fighting.
I mean, I guess it makes sense that the more open you are to different areas, right, the more opportunities are going to come along.
Right.
You're basically increasing the chance that something else is going to come along, right? By not being so rigid in what you can do.
Well, and just the willingness that, I mean, one, I think it requires some curiosity,
Mm.
to look around and see things that look interesting, and then have the confidence that you can turn this feeling that something looks interesting into, an actual, uh, expertise within this, and that you sort of know how. I mean, there are concepts and vocabulary, and, they live in books, and they live in the heads of people who are already expert that you can ask
Mm.
questions of. And you just have to be comfortable. I would say you have to be comfortable feeling stupid, because every time you take on a new area, and a great example of this is programming. You see this with people that sort of, they think it'd be a really cool thing to learn how to write programs, and then they try it for a while, and, you know every person who's ever tried it is enormously frustrating, because it's like every time I don't get a comma in the right place, everything blows up, and I'm ready to, to punch my fist through the wall. And,
Yep.
you know, and but the response is to feel, um, to feel like you're stupid. It's like all these other people are doing this. There must be something wrong with my brain where I'm not able to learn how to do this. And it's
Mm.
like, no, everybody that's really good at doing this went through exactly the same thing. They just stuck with it to the end.
Yeah.
And, and there will be other people who will just find the whole process utterly fascinating. And, and it's like the harder it is, the more tenacious they are. And, and they never seem to have any sort of emotional angst over feeling like they're dumb because it's hard. And yes, it's hard. Every interesting thing is hard. Um, and we all start out not knowing. And the process to go from not knowing to knowing is always an emotionally challenging process.
Mm.
Um,
But it
and
helps you build resilience, right? Helps you become more resilient the more you do this.
well, I mean, you can look back and you have many instances of proof that uh, that you can do it, and that the fact that you couldn't do it from day one doesn't mean that you're less of a person, or you're
Mm.
dumb, or you're not smart enough. It just means that at that point you didn't have knowledge, and then at a later point you did have knowledge. And and then, and the starting point is the learning, but then you have to apply it. Is the other thing,
Yeah.
is that the what's in the books will only take you so far, and then you have to start solving problems in the real world, and then you start to build real depth and real nuance to it. um and then at some points it gets boring, because it's like you can see all the problems and the solutions, and everything is too easy now.
You want
and
something new.
and then you start itching, feeling this itch, and start to look around to see what things you can poke your nose in and mess around with, that might be more interesting.
But this journey you've had, I mean, it's quite unique, I have to say. I've spoken to a lot of people and it's so unique. And I know you've said that we can talk about this, so I'm going to bring it up. But it would be interesting to hear from you about the kind of start of your life, because I know that you'd spoken previously about needing to escape, and that's how you ended up doing what you were doing. If you're happy to talk about that.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So I had the unique experience of growing up in a cult. And it was like a real life, like, Book of Revelations, end of days, the apocalypse will be here in 6 months, um, end of the world cult, and highly isolated. You couldn't have any kind of social interactions outside the membership of the cult. It was a pretty interesting childhood. Uh,
I can imagine. Well,
and
I don't know if I can actually.
uh, and it was one of those things where, at an early age, I uh, understood that there was a lot of bullshit here, and this was not where I wanted to be. And uh, and the other thing too was growing up in a family that didn't have a history of education. Um, uh, so no one in the family had ever finished high school. Um, no one had gone to university. My father was originally a farmer. Um, and as a small kid, I grew up on his first farm went under before I was born. Then, as a small kid, I grew up on a farm in rural, very rural southern Mississippi, with no indoor plumbing, an outhouse in back, a hand pump water well. We raised chickens and hogs and grew vegetables. And uh, you know, I never had a TV growing up. We'd have a radio because you could hear the preacher on the radio, and no books. And it was like, at a very early age, I knew that wherever I should be was not here. and uh, and again, at a fairly early age, I started plotting how I was going to get out. And so, one of the early things I understood was that, if I was going to get out of here, I needed wheels. I
Mm.
needed a car. So at 12, I went to work washing dishes in a restaurant. Um, Back when child labor laws were not nearly so closely enforced, and with the sole purpose of buying a car, because I knew if I had a car, I could get out. And so at 15, a year before I had a driver's license, I bought my first car. And so I bought it, I owned it, I owned the title to it. No one could, and in those days, basically, if you were if you could write the check for it and fill out the paperwork and were tall enough to, slip it over the edge of the counter, you had the title. They never ask if you had a driver's license. They never ask anything.
Wow.
And so, and then 2 years after that, I was gone. So, but that early experience, what part of what that taught me was that sometimes the greatest risk you can take is to take no risk at all. Because the not taking a risk means you stay forever where you are, and um, you know, and you know, personally, I'm not a big believer in afterlives and reincarnation, so I assume we got one shot at this life, and you can either you know do something with it or just piss it away,
Mm.
and and you look at a lot of people and they let themselves stay trapped in things um, without ever having the courage or mounting the energy to break out of the trap. And and the traps are all inside your head.
It's
So
kind
it's
of better the devil you know sometimes, isn't it? For many
I
people.
mean, it, it's sort of as bad as things are. One more day of it is bearable,
Mm.
versus that fear of making the leap. Um, and Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I saw that was also kind of formative for me was when I was in my mid 20s, for a lot of complicated reasons having to do with kind of issues within my own family. I separately went through formal training as a crisis counselor, and I worked for about 4.5 years in a what was nominally was a suicide crisis hotline, although most of our calls were not related to suicide, and but the bulk of the calls were actually related to domestic violence. And one of the things that I would see in that role is we would have women call in these extremely abusive relationships. We would go to extraordinary lengths to get them physically out of the environment into a women's shelter with their kids, connect them with social service agencies. So a lot of us of what we were doing at that time was acting as kind of a connector of social resources, you know, get them, access to this huge range of social service agencies. And then 2 months later, 3 months later, you'd pick up the call and it's the same person. And they're back in the home. You know, the husband has works out in the chemical plant, has got his paycheck, and he drank half of it and came home and beat the wife and kids, and is now out drinking the other half of it. And now she wants someone to come and help extract her again. And that pull back to what as horrible as it is often and these are really, really tragic circumstances. That pull back to what feels safer than this idea of how do I earn a living with no education?
Mm.
I've never had a job. How do I pay rent? How do I do all these things by myself? And uh, and so you know, there are people that are in truly tragic circumstances that cannot get over that emotional barrier of that fear of facing all these things that are unknown, that are going to be necessary to get out of that environment. And uh, I mean, those of us that have years and years of university and a lot of education, and we often are struggling with the same issues at the emotional level, even though our circumstances are much nicer. I mean, again, it's you have a nice job,
Mm.
you're working that pipetter every day in the lab. And it doesn't seem that bad. I can do it another week. Um, and but you end up with the same sort of impetus that ends up keeping you in the same place. Um, and if that place isn't particularly horrible, it's even easier to stay there. You know, and again, the example I gave is that even in circumstances that are truly horrifying, it's often still easier to stay in that situation than to face the fears of all the things you've got to do and master to get yourself out of that. Even with enormous amount of outside help, you still have to get through that fear and that emotional trauma of making those changes. And so, so I think it can be very easy to stay permanently stuck in one area. and just not make that jump out, even though you really have that want, that desire to.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I mean, I feel like we could talk about that for hours because I know myself there's quite a lot of research into that mindset and, the area that you just spoke about, the kind of extremes of why people don't move out. Like we could just go on and on and on. Um, but I feel like we should end it here because we'll be here for hours. But I did want to ask you, where can people find you, find out more about you? Um, I think people are going to be absolutely fascinated and mind blown by this story and your journey. So, where can they find you?
Probably the best place is LinkedIn. Just Dale W. Harrison. Um, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. I just recently started getting active. I actually never posted on LinkedIn until the end of August, but I'm actually closing in on about 1 million impressions on my posts so far, and people seem to like them. They're kind of all over the board. Not much of it is actually about biotech or life sciences, although I do a weekly LinkedIn Live specifically on kind of commercialization issues around biotech. But I post on a lot of other topics, mostly related to some aspect of B2B marketing. Although I'm about to start posting some stuff on specifically about the clinical diagnostics industry as well.
Oh, I think that will be
And
hugely helpful. Yeah.
and some of the things that I see as looming problems and challenges with the way some of these companies are trying to commercialize their products, especially bypassing the clinical environment with these direct to consumer products like
Mm,
Galleri from Illumina or Cologuard. Those are two sort of big names out there with these direct to consumer diagnostics that I think are setting the industry up for a crackdown by the regulators.
yeah.
And so that's an area that I want to start talking about as well. But if you want to follow any of that, I mean, LinkedIn is really the best place, and feel free to reach out to me, with a direct message on LinkedIn. If if you want to hire me, I'm always looking, always
I'm
looking for
sure you'll
interesting
be
problems to
inundated
work
after
on.
this.
But always looking for interesting problems to work on and interesting companies to work with.
Yeah, I honestly thank you so much. It's been a joy. I just love
It's been
hearing your
fun.
story and it's been great. And to everyone else, thank you for listening in again. If you have any questions or any feedback, do let me know or get in touch with Dale yourself. And we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks.